Good afternoon, South African time. Welcome to this webinar on one of the interesting, challenging, and I suppose topics that is really in the field of discussion in the mix right now is how to calculate directors' remuneration. And I think we approach this from a number of different areas. It's really interesting to see how directors are getting paid, but it's also really interesting to see on the flip side the perspective, the perceptions of how and what directors should be paid as well. My name is Roger Hitchcock. I'm going to be taking you on this interesting journey through some practices and principles around directors' remuneration. And a topic I think that is unfolding, a topic that there's no golden handbook that has fallen down from heaven telling us how to remunerate the directors we have, or telling the directors we have how they should be remunerated. And I think that's really, really important to unpack and to think about. And so we're going to give you some insight into what we've done in this space to try to get a handle on director remuneration, as well as explore some ideas and some thoughts. Having been in this boardroom space for the last decade at least, it's really interesting to see the themes that have emerged over time. As we start, let me tell you a little bit about who Cedar is, if you haven't come across us. Cedar Group is actively involved in what we call the boardroom space throughout Africa and also beyond that, but primarily across Africa, where essentially our role is to help directors, help companies work out when they should be governed, how they should be governed. And so we spend a lot of time educating directors. We spend a lot of time face-to-face with directors, really teaching them not the technicalities. We believe that the key thing about boardroom performance is that it needs to happen effectively in the boardroom. The practical application in the boardroom is absolutely essential to us especially from a training, from an education point of view. We also, in the process of doing that, obviously equip directors to hold positions in the boardroom. And so we have a service that helps directors find companies and companies find directors. That appointment process that is often tricky, often the match, and as that in itself is a whole conversation, because the directorship typically has been this thing that has belonged to a club, been part of who you know more than what is known. And I suppose we're trying to challenge that as well as we work in Africa, and we're seeing some really interesting things there. And then thirdly, we do help companies, boards work. We do through helping guide boards in how they should structure themselves, what steps they should take, everything from the technical aspects of how do you structure, how do you put together a board, but also the practical running of a board, because the running of a board is such an important aspect in organizations and becoming more and more pertinent, more and more challenging in today's environment. The role of the board is really under the spotlight, and I think the pandemic has merely put into the spotlight what was in the spotlight before. Or maybe not so much the spotlight, but behind the scenes. We've seen lots and lots of businesses in trouble, and I think the pandemic has shown how in trouble some of those businesses are. But at the flip side, how we are seeing some really, really good moves made by companies whose boards have engaged during this time. And so we want to address, that's the context. A bit of training, you'll see a bit of thinking about how do we apply these concepts. If you're a director, an independent director, hopefully some tools to think about the conversations you need to have. If you're thinking about appointing board members, then really some of the things to consider. And then also, what are we in for in terms of guidance? Because the role of the board is becoming more and more critical in today's world. Just in terms of some rules of engagement, I'm obviously presenting through Zoom, and Zoom has some great facilities, a Q&A box, a Q&A function, a chat box. I have both of those in front of me. It's great also to see the list of people attending. Welcome. Some familiar names and some not so familiar names. It's always good to meet new people, even though it's online. Hopefully one day it'll be face to face. So please use those facilities as we go. I'll keep my eye on both of those. Someone said, thank you for the invite. You are across as anonymous, so I'm going to thank you generally for being here. And as we go, I'll either stop and address specific questions as they come up, there'll certainly be a chance at the end to ask and to close off any questions. There'll be an opportunity to do that as they go. So I will manage my flow as I also see the questions pop up. Yes, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SEDAR website on our webinars page, probably from early next week. So thanks, Guy, for that. We've already actually had people say to us, please make sure that it is recorded so that we can reference it. Just a quote, and I always like to start with a quote that gets me thinking, and so I always look and say, well, what are some of the challenging aspects of directorship? Well, I love this quote, Cary Grant, the old days Hollywood, do your job and demand your compensation, but in that order. You see, I think the challenges, the role of the board is such a critical one, but too often we think of board members being linked directly to shareholding, being linked directly to executive functions in the company. And so this concept of how do we pay these people? How do we structure compensation or remuneration or a package for these people who are playing a critical role in our businesses? And effectively, as I like to illustrate, wearing the director's jacket is a jacket of liability, a jacket of authority, a jacket of responsibility. It's no longer merely a status jacket. And so I want to pick up on some of the things, as I said, the themes that we've seen unfold during our time together. When I'm asked the question, how much should we pay our directors, as I often have, this is the phrase that springs to mind. Well, how long is a piece of string? You see, the challenge is, this is something that doesn't fit neatly into a lot of our thinking around organizations. Also, the fact that we normally start our companies and we build business models without even considering the fact that there is a governance role in organizations that needs to be played. And if it's a governance role that needs to be played, it's a governance role that needs to be paid for. And you'll see I'll close with that thought that actually we need to start thinking of building governance into our business models more assertively than we do up until now, because essentially when we think business model, we're essentially thinking operations and how do we make the most of that. And yet the cost of running a business has to include the cost of governing a business, and that's everything from board processes right through to the directors that sit around the boardroom table and carry the liability and the authority of the company. In trying to answer this question, how long is a piece of string? 2 years ago, SEDAR launched a survey, and in the compensation or directors compensation space, directors remuneration space, there have been over the last 10 or 15 years a number of surveys. The challenge is most of those surveys have focused almost exclusively on listed companies and larger companies, because often that's the information that is available. You can survey the remuneration of listed companies in today's world because that's part of the disclosure requirements of a listed company. It's transparent. And I think one of the reasons that it's being drawn on so much, and also we are seeing certain trends around changes in remuneration, is because of its transparency. We're seeing pressure around the world in terms of this issue of CEO remuneration, which obviously is different from what we're talking about today, but mainly because of the transparency. But we're also seeing trends in terms of non-executive directors and independent directors specifically, and how do we remunerate them? What kind of package, what kind of plan do we put in place to ensure that their input into the business is mutually recognized through the right remuneration? And so what SEDAR did 2 years ago, we launched the first non-executive and independent directors fees survey. And this was aimed at looking and saying, because there has been no base for these discussions, and having been in the boardroom space for over 10 years, it's a conversation that has come up over and over and over again. And so to get some foundation in terms of what has been covered, and we'll refer to this survey as we go through the webinar today, and some interesting insights have come out of it. I do encourage you to download the survey. You'll see the link there on the page. Please download it and read it and process it. It's the second one we've launched recently, and we have recently launched the third one for this year. So at the end of the webinar today, I'm going to put up a link, and please go into that and complete that survey, because the more information we can get, the more information we can provide. And I think that's our aim of this. What I want to do based on that is really think through in the next 40 minutes or so, is really think about what are some of the current practices, what have we seen, as well as what is being seen out there. What does that mean then in terms of when we're thinking about directors' remuneration? What are the factors to consider? And I think some of what we're seeing is almost obvious, but some of it is maybe not so obvious. And so what principles emerge from what we're seeing, and also what principles emerge from the other flows, the other news flows, the other debates that are happening in this governance space. And then I'd like to give you a couple of handles at the end of the webinar in terms of how do you, if you're needing to have this conversation, some handles for facilitating the conversation going forward, things to look at either in your own business. And I've recognized that on this webinar, there are those people who are formalizing, enhancing, building a board. And so thinking around how much do we actually have to spend on that. From that perspective, there are those of you who are also sitting and saying, well, I'd like to serve, or I do serve as an independent director or a non-executive director, maybe even an executive director on my own board, and how much of my remuneration should I consider as part of that role, or think about as part of that role as well. And so what we try to do with the survey is to really ask the question, what's happening in the current context? We have a fairly broad, wide African footprint. We have offices in South Africa, where I'm based, in Pretoria, but also Cape Town, Joburg. We also have offices in Kenya and a presence there. We also have offices in Ghana, but we operate into all three of those and beyond, and regions beyond that. So really just ask, what are the questions people are also raising about these issues? Because people have worked out how to pay going forward. Now, as I said, it's the piece of string question, but it's also far more complex and convoluted than that, because there are lots of factors to take into account. And working in different regions, I think, has given us the privilege of being able to examine some of the multiplexity or the multidimensionality complexity of some of these issues that are being faced. And so when we're looking at it, we're saying, well, how do we take out, how do we look at and explore and examine and think about, the clear and transparent remuneration policies that have started to become a growing concern for boards in recent years, because the transparency element of governance has become critical. The media has focused on this concept of remuneration and compensation, and some of that, as we know, is focused and related, on directors, and some more specifically on CEOs and senior management. And I think that's one of the key things that we're seeing emerge over time. And so the problem is privately held and family businesses have struggled to determine, because there are very few reference points. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to say, is there a reference point or a range of reference points that can be appropriate for thinking about how much people earn? And yeah, I think one of the principles is also to make sure that is fair, because the recognition that is emerging as the legal landscapes are changing is that directors carry a significant role in organizations, both those that are executive and those that are non-executive and independent. And in law, there is no distinction between the two. So let's look and see, what did we find as we unpacked and examined? What are some of the factors out there? And most of this you'll find in some degree of detail in the survey. Let's start by saying, well, actually, what is the quantum? So what are some of the amounts? What is the range of director remuneration? And it's very wide. It literally goes from nothing to lots. Okay, in terms of thinking, there's a lot of companies where they have people and they have the privilege of incredible input for people who are willing to effectively hold the role and play the role for nothing or very, very little. At the other end of the equation, there are those that pay significant amounts for independent directorship, and we see some of those amounts in the listed and larger companies, but we're starting to see that go down. And actually, one of the trends internationally is that the payment for independent directors, or the payment of independent directors, is trending upwards, because as the liability is being recognized, so also we're seeing that, and we'll see how that unfolds in terms of the surveys into the future. But if you look at the ranges, so when we take out some of those extremes, we do get a range between $1,848,000 US. These are all annual amounts. All of the amounts in the survey are annual amounts. We also see different ways of paying, and I think that's one of the challenges, is that sometimes directors are paid what is called a seat fee or a sitting fee. I personally don't like that term because it means I'm only earning money when I'm in the seat. Plus, the role of directors is far beyond the time that they spend in the boardroom on the boardroom seat because of the multiplexity of their role. We see 25% are paid less than $4,000. So if we look at bringing those out, so a quarter below $4,000, 4,000 and 8,000, we see 20%, about a third of directors are paid between that amounts. Another 20% between $8,000 and $15,000. So these are the kind of slices we're starting to see emerge, and those are significant enough, slices. And then 28% paid more than $15,000. And so there is this range, but we're also seeing a clustering, and it's almost an even clustering across. So the percentage groupings, it's quite interesting, that have emerged, which points to the fact that there essentially a lot of people are getting, as I often say, the golden rule underlying it all is we get what we negotiate. And without a benchmark, sometimes those things cluster. And obviously there's legitimacy across the board in terms of how much people are being paid. Some of the specific results is that obviously one of the critical things, or one of the main, let me jump and then I'll go back, that obviously company turnover is by far the largest driver of director fees in Africa. Companies that have got bigger turnover, and we can see it here, and I said a fairly direct link. There's a couple of slight anomalies, but essentially what we do see is the trend is that the larger the revenue, the larger the fees that are paid. And that's obviously an affordability issue. So one of the drivers there is obviously what can we afford? The other issue is obviously, well, what are we paying for? Because as companies get larger, the complexity of the businesses typically gets larger, not always, but typically gets more complex. I know some small businesses that are extremely complex, and maybe you need to think about that. But you do also see some interesting fluctuations there. But the trend seems to be, and by far the largest driver is that. So obviously, if you are looking for independent roles, one of the things to think about is which companies are you equipped to serve on? Because obviously companies that are larger in revenue and larger in complexity are going to be looking for different things in their independent directors than other companies that are smaller or less complex. One of the other things obviously related to size is the number of people in the business. And so what we find again is that there is this correlation to some extent in terms of size of the company, and as the companies grow in size, number of people, they tend to pay more fees. Again, with there being a slight anomaly at the bottom of smaller companies, and I think that's one of the interesting things we're finding. And what we're finding is that your smaller companies are often your younger companies. Again, this is an assumption. So younger companies that are smaller are recognizing that actually we need to put the right people around the boardroom table if we want to become those larger companies. And we emphasize a lot that you've got to think of the governance requirements of your business before they happen. And so companies that are wanting to grow in size, revenue, and people need to start thinking early and get those capabilities into the business as early as possible, as they can. So that's another interesting thing. So by far the biggest correlation is size, and I suppose size and complexity of the companies, and that's a logical conclusion. Something that was a bit of a surprise for us was the fact that there was a difference, a slight difference in terms of gender, and it wasn't what you would expect from a lot of the news flows. We found that the women who participated in our survey earned on average about 6% more than the men who participated in our survey. Now, part of that could be that we're starting to see a shift and a change. A lot of the businesses we work with are growing businesses. A lot of them have been founded by the teams of women. They're founded by women, and a lot of them are family businesses that are starting to bring the second and third generation into the governance of the business. And a lot of this are obviously daughters who are coming into the equation. And so it's an interesting finding, and hopefully it'll continue, because I think that's such an important thing. It means that at some levels and in some businesses, and I know that there is more complexity than this shows often, but it does show that at the right level of competence, the right level of scarcity, possibly, there is potentially an opportunity to negotiate slightly higher fees in that way. One of the other interesting ones as well was the regional difference. So again, linked possibly to some of the profile of some of these businesses, we find that in East Africa, significant amounts more than the other areas, essentially. And I think one of the things is we do see in East Africa, there's a massive cluster of family-held businesses that are substantial, have a lot of momentum. In fact, if you look at some stats, one of the biggest clusters of significant family-held businesses in Africa is in East Africa, Kenya, and surrounds. And I think that's significant, is that they are starting to recognize, and I think it's often the family businesses that are successful that recognize in their second, third, fourth generation that they need to govern themselves properly, and bringing in independent directors. Obviously, it has its own challenge in a family business, but it is a insight, a skill set that is obviously valued and certainly remunerated at a slightly higher level. And you can see some of the countries there. So there's also this distinction per region and per country, which is a fascinating dynamic. Which also means, it indicates that there's very little there are very few handles to grasp onto when we have this debate around how much we need to be remunerating our directors. And then the last big kind of number that comes out of the survey, before there's a couple of other points to touch on, is to look at, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, you can get the details in the survey itself, but there's obviously another dimension, is the sector the business is in. And I think part of this is that different sectors have underlying business models that are different, and there are different levels of margin, different levels of profitability, different levels per sector. And I suppose one of the challenges is we also see in some of the groups of companies a diverse grouping of businesses, and that's often a challenge to how do you match different fees across the different types of businesses in a kind of multifaceted group of companies. We often see that happening in family businesses, where the growth is almost organic and opportunistic, and also creates the spread. But it's interesting, there's quite a spread. You can see from the lowest $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a year, right up to the $30,000, $40,000 a year in terms of the average per sector. Now, obviously, these survey results in the second survey, they're starting to build up a track record. And so we do encourage you, as I said, to go through that, download the survey, the link is there again, but also please participate in the survey going forward. So those are some of the specifics in terms of what we are seeing, what we're examining. And I think what it emphasizes is that there is a need for a deeper conversation, and also there's a lot of flexibility out there in terms of how to structure directors' remuneration. What we're also seeing, though, on the flip side, so at the same time we're surveying remuneration, we're also looking at some of the contribution that different directors are seen to make to companies. And I think this does speak very strongly to the fact that there are roles at governance level in our organizations which are, if we aren't including, we're potentially losing out in terms of value. So let's look at some of these other drivers and outcomes that we're seeing emerge from the survey. One of them that is really interesting is that boards with at least one independent director are outperforming boards without one, and that's directly linked to the standard measurables, EBITDA. So boards without independent directors, this is phrased in the negative, but boards without independent directors are less likely to report an increase in EBITDA. And I suppose the performance of our businesses is a critical thing to be aware of. And one of the things is to recognize that a cost that looks big could be easily compensated for by the increase in value, underlying value, or the growth. And so that's also an interesting one, is it's not just the value, but it's the increase in. And we're seeing companies, and especially in today's world, and one of the debates we've had with a number of people is, well, what do we do with fees in today's world? Do we reduce fees? Do we change fees? And our viewpoint is, as far as is possible, keep things the same. Obviously, if employees are being reduced, it's pertinent to have that discussion at director level. But remember that it's governors who are going to pull businesses through the challenges we're going through. It's governance thinking that may be happening at your operational level, but it's governors who can think strategically, who can open up new doors, who can think about the underlying value of these businesses and how do we unlock the value of the businesses ultimately, and how do we also lead and govern and guide the companies back to profitability, which is what a lot of businesses are going to be, lacking and missing in the next couple of periods. And so very important to think when we're understanding how much people are paid, to also link that to the value they create in our organizations. And I know that the concept of independence, and we'll touch on it later, is one that should be unlinked to value. In other words, we don't want to link payment to performance, but that doesn't mean that directors can't be paid reasonably and paid well for the job that they do. In terms of some of the other concepts, and this is where the package including or excluding equity is important. So interesting, 92% of NEDs did not receive equity, and all independent directors didn't. So one of the key principles, and this is why the remuneration conversation is such an important one, because normally what we do, or what often happens at board level, is there's normally this dropping of fees in view of another benefit that'll come often through equity. Now that either is done at executive level, and there's legitimacy there because equity can be based and linked to short-term performance, and so that's what we're wanting to motivate. At shareholder level, obviously, that's part of it, and sometimes that's how people become shareholders of businesses. But ultimately, to get that independent perspective, it's really, really important to not link the remuneration package to the equity of the business, even though, as we've seen, that the role of independent directors does grow that equity ultimately. Just one question that's come up, and I think this is really important. Thanks, Ashish, and I'm glad that you picked it up now. So the way to differentiate non-executive directors from independent directors, essentially, let's take one step back. There are essentially two different broad classes of directors. There are those that are involved in the running of the business every single day. Those are called executives. The non-executives are those that are not involved in the running of the business every day, but they may have another relationship with the company. They could be shareholders, they could be contractors, they could be related to somebody involved in any of those things. So an independent director is, in short, someone who only has one relationship with the company, and that's their directing relationship with the company. And that's the simple way. There's a bit of nuance around that, but essentially that's the key distinction between a non-executive and an independent director. And it's one code that uses the phrase non-independent, non-executive director is actually the Mauritian Code of Governance, but it's often a phrase that is helpful at the end of the day. Another key thing here, which I think is really important to put in the mix and reflect on, is that there is a link between having independent directors on a board and its ability to self-reflect, be it formally through an evaluation process, because what we found was that boards without independent directors evaluated themselves poorly compared to boards with at least one independent director. So it's not just the value that independent directors bring and should be paid for, but it's also the self-reflection. And as we know, when things change, they can change radically, and the only way we can get through those changes is reflect on how we're doing, reflect on our businesses, and reinvent ourselves. And I think we're seeing those boards, those companies, as I said, it's the governors who are going to bring the companies through the crisis. It's not necessarily going to be the executive teams that have, are entrenched in the business. Now, obviously, it's a balance, and I'm not using that as a blanket statement, but it's governance thinking. And in today's world, independence thinking of governors that is going to help and assist us review our strategies, review our risks, review our footprint, our stakeholder footprint, those kind of things at a governance level, and not only at a management level. And that's the critical thing we are getting when we are having independent directors in the company, is they have one relationship with the company. As a director, they share liability with every other director sitting around that table, but they are there to bring that independent insight. They're still expected to understand the business. They're still expected to, add value to the business. And so their engagement is often one that can see the different perspective that our companies need in times of need. And so if we put some of these concepts together, so we've got some ideas in terms of how much is being paid. We've got some idea in terms of, the diversity of factors that is being looked at. And as we see time go on, we'll see more detail in this. Just looking quickly, I think I've addressed some of those. So the other category, you can, if you download the survey, you can get some more information on that and get that from the survey and the details underlying that. And then the one comment, thanks Mzwaka, is really thinking about the equality and inequality. And I think one of the challenges is that our CEO compensation models, and I'm not going to talk about that here because I see another question, comment coming out of there. There's a whole lot of other factors, and that's a whole conversation on its own. But one of the challenges we've seen internationally is CEO or executive compensation go through the roof, where a lot of other compensation hasn't. And that's a challenge in itself. But as I said, if we start talking about that, you'll be here all afternoon. So if we look at putting a lot of this together, what we're seeing out there, what we've uncovered, how do we then think about some principles to consider if we have to have this conversation around deciding how much we're going to pay people or deciding how much we need to negotiate? And as I said, I'm aware that I'm speaking to two sides of the equation, which is absolutely fine. Is I do think that there's a range of different things, maybe circles or contexts to think through as we go through the thinking. We obviously have to think about the broader context. And the broader context is, what region do we operate in, what country, and are we multi-regional? Because remember, a lot of the ability to think about where we pay is linked to complexity. And so some environments are far more complex than others, and that's related obviously to the context and the environment we are working in. We're starting to see, as mentioned, difference in different regions. Whether that continues, whether we see that trend continue, but really important to think about what are the contextual, the environmental issues, and especially if you are moving into another region or moving out of another region. So you are serving from maybe Kenya as a non-exec position in West Africa or vice versa. It's important to understand the complexity and what you need to deal with and what the thinking that is required. So if you are looking for independent directors, are you looking for perspectives that are part of your region, part of another region, and how does that relate to how much people are expecting at the end of the day? Then obviously the enterprise factors. And here we've spoken to those. There's obviously the size elements, and size being revenue and people. And I think the people issue of size is often more complex than the revenue issue, but obviously they are linked. And there are complexity issues with revenue, and there are complexity issues with people. That's often linked to the sector. So going back to the thinking we had earlier about size and sector, and what does the business model look like? What can the business model fundamentally, deliver and afford? And I'm going to address the issue of saying, well, we need, if we run businesses, to really build governance into our business model. But it's also about the complexity of the business. I think some challenges of businesses continually going through this challenge of, it tends to get more complex and then simplify, more complex or simplify on an individual business level as well as the environment level. And so it's managing the complexity. And I like to use the comparison between it being complicated or being complex. Sometimes our businesses look complex, but they are just complicated. They're not well governed. They're not well designed. And so the enterprise factors, because that affects the risk factors that I, as an individual director coming into a business, would face. It also affects when things are complicated. And by complicated, I mean more complex than necessary. So Einstein said things need to be as simple as possible, as complex as necessary. And I suppose our businesses, we are continually, in governance, we are continually walking that fine line between complex, simple. Simple as necessary, or as possible, complex as necessary. If we get that equation out, then it's complicated. And so sometimes we think things are more complicated than they are, but that's also related to the stage or maturity of the business. The reality is there is a different risk profile for businesses at different stages of maturity. You know, lowest levels of stage of maturity are when essentially businesses are opportunistic and growing opportunistically with very few formal systems in place, normally a smaller team. Coming into that team as a percentage of workforce, in a sense, is significantly more and possibly significantly higher risk than coming into a business which has got an established framework that has dealt with the complicatedness and is now, you know, appropriate in terms of complexity and the stage and maturity. Understanding, though, that obviously businesses go through various stages of growth, and it's crossing those thresholds to the next level, which is important. And so sometimes it's recognizing that a business needs some outside input to cross the next threshold. And that could be what you need to pay for as a, you know, pay for in inverted commas as a business, is maybe you've hit a ceiling. And the only way to get out of that isn't more operational capability or capacity. It's actually a different level of thinking and deciding that can only happen at board level. And so recognizing where your business is, the enterprise factor is from the inside out, but also recognizing if I'm looking at a company to be a director of, what should I look at? What should I be asking about? Because that helps, in a sense, pitch what the level of you know, remuneration could be, and also the way that it is structured going forward. And then obviously there are the director factors, the personal factors. And in my mind, as I was putting this together, I mean, one of the challenges I had is that I was jumping between enterprise and director, enterprise and director. And I think one of the challenges we have is that it's the match. And I think that's why I wasn't quite sure how to put this on slides. Chose to do it this way because there are the director factors. So the skills and experience, which obviously need to be matched to what the organization needs. And skills and experience linked back to the organization. What stage is the business at? What's the business's strategy? What are the sector the business is at? And how comprehensively is that understood by the business? And then what is my role? Because remember that every director is a part of a team. And so when we're thinking about even how much we pay individual directors, it should be seen as the team. All right, because it's part of the team. And remember, we are paying directors not for them as individuals, but also for their contribution to the team. And so we use a number of tools to think about that. And it links, obviously, in our appointment processes, we take into account experience and skills, but also other things that people will bring to the table in terms of contribution. There's obviously a scarcity factor, as I alluded to, the fact that we have seen, and in some countries, I think it was either Norway and Canada, when they legislated for the first time a number of years ago, specific percentages of women on boards. What tended to happen was a very small group of women, their remuneration went through the roof and they effectively became unaffordable. And so scarcity is an issue, obviously, from a director point of view. Now, that could be scarcity from a diversity point of view, as I've just mentioned, or scarcity from a skill set point of view. Some of the skills that are needed on some boards in today's world are, you know, IT skills at a level not before conceptualized. Security, we all saw the Garmin issue a couple of weeks ago. That's important. I think directors who've governed through a crisis that is in any way similar to what we're going through, and obviously that's one of the challenges. It could be that, is how do we build the concept of resilience into our board even during this time where it's challenging. And so the scarcity aspect becomes a challenge, and that's obviously how, linked back to the enterprise, do we need to change our businesses? Do we need to transform the enterprises we're part of? And then what roles do they play? You know, so again, the formality of our boards dictates the time requirements, dictates the information requirements. And remember, the time requirements of directors are not only linked to what they do in the boardroom, but it's far broader than that. And so these three factors of, you know, thinking of the the broader context, understanding that, the enterprise factors. And so if you are looking to formalize your board, those are things to take into account when you're starting to put together the requirements. If you're an independent director or someone who wants to serve on a board, ask the question, what do I fit into? And don't be stuck to your sector, but what contribution do you bring in terms of all of those areas? So in the last few minutes, what I want to do is kind of bring it back and say, well, then, are there some from this? Are there some rules of thumb? And thanks for the question around ranking of skills on demand by boards. I think that's an important thing. And this conversation in itself could be one that goes on a lot. I think, as I mentioned, we are seeing some significant demand for IT skills on boards, but IT architecture skills. Because remember, the perspective of the board has to be on the organization as a whole. It's working on the organization and not in the organization. So sometimes the mindset shift from managing to directing or managing to governing is one that is challenging. We're also seeing, I think, one of risk, properly assessing risk, understanding complexity. Some of those characteristics are not necessarily, and possibly I was amiss in not putting up there things like EQ, thinking skills, processing skills, because I think that's part of the director factors that are really, really essential, and especially the team as well. So some rules of thumb, and essentially when I'm asked the question, have been asked the question over the years, I normally try to simplify it and say, okay, what are the factors one needs to think about when we are thinking about remunerating directors? And I'd love to get some more questions if they're in your mind, because we're heading towards the end, in a sense, of the webinar, and I'd like to address any key questions that people have in their minds. Firstly, it's time. Now, this is where, as I mentioned, I'm not a fan of the phrase sitting fee, because then it assumes that we're basically getting money for sitting in a seat. Directors get money for carrying 24/7, 365 the accountability for the enterprise. All right, and there are a number of different surveys, and this is a range, I know, of ours, but many of the surveys that are coming out that are quite precise in their findings, and most of these you can find online, where you can ask the question, what time requirements are there on directorship? And there seems to be consensus that it is a range of time between 160 to 320 hours per annum. And I know that's broad, but it relates to, obviously, your role, your committee roles, the complexity of the business. And remember what that includes. So one of the key responsibilities of directors, the legal responsibilities of directors, is to act with diligence. So it's care, skill, and diligence. And this diligence element is obviously a time element. It's the time in the boardroom, but it's the time preparing for the boardroom. And so the guideline there is that if you're not spending at least somewhere between half the amount of time to double the amount of time preparing for each board meeting, then you probably don't have enough information or the adequate flow of information through the board meeting. And obviously you start adding that together, it's essentially a month to 2 months work. At the 2 months work, you're probably chairing a board, chairing a committee or two. Maybe the company is highly complex, or going through some challenges and changes. I know some directors who've been appointed to boards who have had to be highly engaged for the first 3 to 6 months, simply because of the state of those companies. And it's not that they're getting operationally involved, they're just having to put things in place. And so time requirements are really, really important to think about. The next one is to think about is obviously skills. And this is where possibly it's the time premium. So it's taking time and adjusting the time based on the stage of the business. So what skills are necessary for linking and understanding the stage, those thresholds. A lot of, especially family businesses, transitioning from second to third or third to fourth. It's helpful to have somebody who's been on that journey before or guided that journey before. The sector, and remember here, we're not talking necessarily about functional skills in the sector. We're looking for the other skill sets that complement the sector. Companies that possibly have reached their own ceiling in terms of sales and are needing to reinvent themselves from a positioning or marketing or identity point of view. And a lot of businesses are in that position right now. Reinvention is critical. And obviously the strategy. What are we looking to do? If your strategy is diversification regionally, you need to think about, do you need to pay someone from another region to help you do that? And then you may need to have to take into account completely different factors. And then the scarcity element. How scarce, how available are those skill sets? And also the thinking, the directing skills. So obviously every director needs to be able to direct. But in addition to that, every director should be bringing some unique skill set to the table that the company needs based on where it's at and what it's going through at this point in time. And then the third one, and this is really the one that is related to that idea or that thought around complexity and complicatedness, is I think there is also an important element in terms of risk premium. And possibly this is the one that is the most like a piece of string. What is the governance and organizational maturity? So if I'm approaching a business and I'm looking at that business from the outside and they've asked me, I'm batch in terms of I'm available, and I'm also of the right skill set, what they need at a certain point of time, I need to be looking and saying, how much risk am I actually taking in this organization? What risk am I carrying? What am I walking into, in a sense? Because that means I need to think about the risk premium I'm willing to or need to accept, need to ask for, need to negotiate for. If the business is highly developed, got everything in place, everything runs and flows, I know that my risk as a director is reduced because the board process itself is taking a lot of those risks off my shoulders because it's dealing with those. If there's very little in place, the risk premium would need to go up. So for those of you who've got companies and you're looking to expand and grow your boards, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, because the more formalized, the more mature your organization is from a governance point of view, the less of a risk premium an independent would be expecting to carry. And so that's possibly a bit of a challenge, because you're needing to build that without necessarily the skill set, because that's what you're looking to get into the room and help you do. And so I use that, as I said, as a rule of thumb. It's time, recognizing that directorship takes time. Directorship isn't a part-time job. What I advise is that if you're a director of a company, or when you're a director of a company, you put the directorship stuff into your calendar first and you let the other things flow around that. Why? Because the directorship role is the most important role in an organization. You can't add directorship into an already busy calendar. And that's a whole other conversation about the capacity of individuals. Your skill set, how clear are you about how well matched it is? So if you're looking for a director, make sure you're clear about what you need, because then you need to find the right match. Because what you don't want to be doing is spending money on someone who doesn't contribute. And so that's one of the challenges, is engagement at board level. And then obviously the governance and organizational maturity elements. What we're wanting to do ultimately in the last couple of minutes is we're wanting to say that the right director in the right team doing the right thing moves company performance. And that's what we're starting to see from the surveys, is we're seeing that where those boards, companies have stepped out, put an independent director on, many of them have done it at risk. They've stepped out and said, well, we know we need this person, we've invested in a person. What they're starting to see as a result is that company performance move. Companies that are more effective, there's more accountability in the businesses, and they're more sustainable ultimately. But it is also about the combination. And so when we're thinking about remunerating directors, don't think of it necessarily only as individual to individual. Think of it in terms of, who's on the team? How's the team constructed? Have you thought about the team and what the recommendations around the team? And so we've done webinars on that as well, which will also be available on our site, on how do you think about composing a team, because that's another part of this whole this conversation. And then the form, how many structures are you having to put in place at governance level, and then what are you doing? And so we run a model that is called the Sadar Enterprise Governance Compass, that essentially says what are the themes of governing and how does one structure that into a board process and board calendar going forward. So if we think about, so there's some people are doing the maths already, and that's interesting to see how that is coming up, and it's interesting to see what the rates and the things are. I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment, but it's interesting, and I think it's fascinating, and I'm glad I've triggered thinking, because what I want to do is also drop a poll up in a second or two to think about this. But if we think about coming out of this webinar in the last few minutes, and please drop any other questions and comments in terms of what's in your mind. Firstly, we also recommend quite strongly that whatever is paid is structured as a monthly fee. Simply because the role of directors is continuous. It's actually a more continuous role in an organization than management, because directorship doesn't have office hours. And so structuring a monthly fee also helps smooth the costing and work it out on that basis. Build it into your business model. Ultimately, we use this phrase in terms of the people we buy, we employ, is you get what you pay for. And ultimately, that's what you get with directorship. If you're not paying for a director, you're getting charity if they're contributing. If they don't contribute, how do you hold them accountable ultimately? So build it into your business model as you go forward. Think long-term value, because there could be ways, and I know that there are some models that I've been exposed to in the last 6 months, 12 months, where people are starting to explore ways of changing how they possibly compensate directors in different ways, but with a long-term value in mind, as opposed to a short-term incentive, because that's what you want to motivate ultimately. Evaluate and rotate. The reality is the director is there for the team and the team is there for the company. Directors are legally obliged to act in the best interest of the company. The team must be constructed for the best interest of the company. And so that's really important. So build board evaluation into your thinking around this issue. Because also, how do you hold individual directors accountable for the amount you're paying them unless you have some kind of, or there is some kind of evaluation process in the mix? And a key part of governance practice is the rotation of directors over time. Not all the time, but a minimum period of 3 to 5 years on a director's contract, and then rotating those directors, because ultimately it's which team does the company need and who's going to play parts on that team. And then there's this underlying paradox that I was also reminded of, is that the irony when we're thinking about independent directors is it's almost as if they need to be well paid, but they need to be people. The paradox is who aren't dependent on what they're being paid. And I know finding those people is often a tricky thing. But often you find, if you can find those people who maybe have a portfolio of directorships, but are able to add and contribute and engage at board level and contribute to board on your board. That's one of the paradoxes amongst many paradoxes that we have at board level. So please, any other questions or comments? I trust this has been valuable. Going back to my first 1 or 2 comments, is the question how much we pay directors, or how much should directors be paid, is in a sense, how long is a piece of string? We're trying to find, through the survey we've been doing, some of the principles and practices that are emerging. And I think what we've been able to show in this webinar is there's a number of different factors. There is the size of the company, the complexity of the business. And so please participate in the 2020 survey. The more input we get, please share it with other people that you know. It's intended to go out there. And obviously we would be very appreciative if you could leverage some of your networks in terms of the survey going forward. Just going to review some of the questions. So the one comment about negotiation, ultimately, I mean, a directorship contract is a contract that exists between the individual and the company. Remember, it is a relationship between the individual and the company, not the relationship between the shareholder and the director. So this is a fee. And I think one of the things, some comments there as well, thanks Ali, is to think about obviously the board attendance. I think if we have to pay people to encourage board attendance, we don't have the right people. Can I make that comment? I know it's a bit blunt, but if our remuneration is to make sure that people are there, then we don't have the right people. We need to look for people who actually want to be engaged at board level, and obviously pay them appropriately. And so that's why that quote, do the work and demand the compensation, but in that order. If we're needing to compensate people to do the work, then I think we need to relook at who's sitting on our board. Sorry, that thought was triggered by that comment as well. And I think that's one of the challenges, is the way we've paid people in the past, paid people in inverted commas, has not necessarily motivated the right behavior or compensated for the risk that directors are taking. And I trust that I've been able to pick up on some of those going forward. Daryl, last comments. Thanks. Good question to close off with. If there's no other ones, directors insurance, directors and officers insurance, because obviously this is a contract between a director and a company. And so part of the thing is we want to get the right directors onto the board. We want to make sure that that equation is closed and we close all the gaps. But there are terms and conditions and expectations on the company from the director. And one of those would be to do whatever is necessary to protect the director in their position so that they can think clearly and be effective in their position. We've touched on board process as being critical. So governance and board maturity is absolutely critical, but directors and officers insurance is another key element. Not protecting against lack of care, lack of skill, or lack of diligence, but if we acted together, Daryl, as two directors on the same board, and we were convinced and can show that we made a good decision despite everything and something went wrong, that's when a director's insurance policy will help out. Much like your car insurance doesn't pay you to crash your car, but pays just in case something happens, and absolutely critical. I think that's really important. And it's part of this broader equation of what is the relationship between a company and its directors. And so I see there's a lot of different comments coming up. I think the key thing is to think about it in terms of what are we paying for? Skill set, we are paying, there is time involved, and so diligence is important. Also, we want to pay for engaged people. We want the people to be engaged, going forward. A couple of questions that have been over the time, I've kind of brushed over them about executive compensation because it's a different conversation altogether. And so apologies for I've seen them, and I think possibly we'll look at doing another webinar on that. Please engage with us. We're going to be sending you, and I'm going to end now because I think I'm running out of time, but you will get a survey to complete. I just want to quickly, in the last couple of minutes, launch a poll in terms of your interest in what you've got out of this webinar. I think we really want to see and ensure that we are providing insight. You can include as many of those. I've made it a multiple choice, so you're able to include as many options as possible, but I trust it's been insightful. Please engage with us. This is a conversation that is actually both massive and it's also developing, like most things in governance. And so what we'll do as well, thanks for that comment about the survey link. I'll ask our back end to make sure that we include the survey link, the new survey link, in the email that you get as a result of attending this webinar. I do appreciate the time you've taken. I do appreciate the time you've invested. I trust it's been valuable, and I trust from some of the comments that have come up, thank you very, very much. I see that it's been insightful for some. Please apply it, especially those of you who need to have this conversation going forward. And so with that in mind, thank you very much for taking the time and making the time. Keep in touch. We're always welcome and always happy to help. I'm going to end the polling now and end the video, in the webinar. Thank you.